Okay, so going back to, I guess we will start from the highlights. We didn't merge anything yet or voted for anything on the dev list, but I just want to highlight that there are ongoing progress. I think the two biggest ones are the server-side capabilities and the OAuth 2 endpoints. And those seems to be in a pretty good shape. So I like to let the two owners talk about those if they have any other remaining concerns. Is that what you? No. So, Robert, do you want to talk about the OAuth 2 PR?
I can briefly. So far, nothing changed, and still no major objections received. So I think we can go ahead with that one, with the first step of that.
So do we want to vote the dev list?
Briefly go over what the first step is.
That deprecation PR.
The deprecation PR. Yep.
So do we want to vote on the dev list, or is this PR sufficient as kind of like a vote?
I think that PR is sufficient.
I think we should vote on the dev list.
Yeah, I think the process
It's
is
a
to
spec
vote
change.
on the dev list, so we should follow that.
Okay.
So it's first vote on the dev list and then merge the PR, right? Not merge, but then have any further comments we can resolve in the PR. Is that right?
I mean, we did that on the dev list now in the discussion thread.
Yeah, I think we want to probably raise a vote thread.
Yeah. So
I think, yeah, sorry, Ryan. I think this have a formal code modification vote, just to be sure that we are on the same page. And also, I will, yeah, I mean, it's important just to keep everyone aware. So,
Yeah, so just a reminder, sorry, JB. A few months ago, we had a dev list discussion where we introduced the formal like Iceberg proposal or Iceberg improvement proposal, which covers any of the specs, and any change to the spec, we should actually bring up a vote thread on the dev list just to make sure everybody is aware of what's changing and that there isn't any opposition to those changes. If we just do it on a PR, then you can add changes, it slips through, people aren't aware of what's actually happening to the specs, which are kind of the most important piece of this. So we need to follow that process. I don't think we've actually gone through that process yet, even though we introduced it months ago. So just raise a vote thread, point to the PR, what changes are being made. We'll do a quick vote and make sure there isn't any sort of dissent. Does that make sense, Robert?
Sure. I mean, would be the first time then, yeah, after this month.
Okay, sounds good. Regarding the server capability PR, I think I did a review, and the only part I realized I didn't talk about was I see there was a previous comment actually from, I think, Ryan, about there are capabilities like table register that are separate from the tables. Are we still having those, or are we all aligned that just having a table capability is sufficient for everything? What is our thoughts there?
I think there's so the way I think about this is we want as few of these things as possible, right? Like if we end up with just a huge list of capabilities, that's going to turn into a mess. To me, that means going in and thinking through like what capabilities are necessary to make certain client-side decisions. So for instance, if you're looking at something like register table, it may well be okay to document in the route Like, hey, if you don't support register table, you know, throw a 500 or not 500. What's the one I'm thinking of? The unsupported operation exception one that
yeah.
501. Okay, yeah. You know, I think that is fine for certain things, especially if they predate the tags, right? Because then you can just say, hey, you know, I know about this route, but I don't support it. I think that would be a reasonable thing. I think obviously like more feedback on that is probably a good thing, but rather than having a capability for a lot of small capabilities, that seems like a fairly nice solution for at the time that we establish the capabilities. Dan?
Yeah, I just want to add that we don't want to over-index on trying to make everything perfectly, you know, configurable via these tags, and that like, oh, I would never make a call to a route because of a capability or something like that. The original motivation for adding this was in cases where the client actually needs to make a choice, or part of the workflow would require that it may or may not make calls to endpoints that would be confusing. So views is the original motivation. And that was because you have to both call like list tables and list views, but you don't want to get an error back from the server because it just didn't implement views, that then you're confused as a client about like, how should I handle this? Like, is this access denied, or is this because it's actually not supported? So I think it's helpful to use it to inform, but we don't have to get to a point of like, hey, we need to check and make sure that like register table or something else, I can't even call that if it's not supported by the server. You can call it and it returns a 404 or a 501 or, you know, a 403. It's not going to be confusing to a user. They're probably going to go and look, hey, is register table supported, and find out, oh, it's not. So we just need to be like, don't over index on enumerating everything. Amog?
Yeah, I guess you mentioned it towards the end of what you said, but like, because I saw in the PR, it seemed like we were trending towards being prescriptive about the error code, like 501. But I guess we talked about in the past that like because of security reasons, certain services may not want to explicitly throw 501, right? So as you said, it could be 404, 403. So I think I would advocate that like if we have to spec out the errors that a server, an endpoint should throw, it should probably be like kind of a wide net, but maybe it loses its utility. But that's something I would advocate for.
Yeah, I think that any error code here would be appropriate for the server, right? Because it's basically a single call that says no.
Yeah.
And in this case, yeah, like Dan is saying, I don't see a ton of benefit from knowing that ahead of time because it's just going to fail. On the other hand, things like, you know, does this view exist? That, you know, triggers fallback behavior, because if a view doesn't exist, you need to know whether it actually doesn't exist and you can create it, or you don't have, you know, credentials to even know whether it exists, or the service doesn't support views in general. I think that there are like different cases there.
So getting
Jack,
back
is
to
that what you're thinking? I'm curious, like,
Yeah.
what's your what are other takes on this? Because this is not like I wouldn't say that this is an easy call. So I think getting more people thinking about it is better.
Yeah, I think last week we kind of, at least in this quorum, have some general consensus, which I replied in the dev list. It's just when I reviewed the PR, I realized somehow the register table is divided into its own thing, and then I was suggesting something else. But it seems like that was an old thing, so we can. Right now, the general consensus is that we just have general text, and I agree with what you said. That seems like the purpose is to have the correct fallback behavior. That is the more important thing. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else have any other comments.
So I just want to add that Edward unfortunately has a conflict with this particular time slot, so he will have to make sure that he gets information back. He'll watch the video and everything, but.
So from logistics perspective, do we also vote for this, or what is the, because if we vote for this, that will be like the OAuth one is like a yes or no, do we deprecate? But this one, what is the thing we vote for actually? Is that the general direction of having these coarse grain tags and the version and mapping to the corresponding versions? Is that the thing we are voting?
We always want to, so I know I've said this a lot, but we don't want to basically vote to decide on a direction, typically, because that means that one group loses, right? Usually what we want to do is talk through issues to form consensus around the right direction to go, and then vote to confirm that consensus, right? It's sort of an opportunity to farm for dissent. So yeah, we're saying, hey, we're going to deprecate this route, right? Like the PR is essentially the change that we're voting on, and we're confirming that we all agree to take that action. It's the same sort of thing here. We figure out how this should work as a group, and then go and have a confirmation vote for that in the dev list. So like all of that discussion should really happen ideally well before we actually confirm that, yes, this is something that we want to do. And that's the same route that we've taken with like the V2 changes to the spec, right? We actually built everything, we kept the spec up to date, and then said, okay, we're actually voting to adopt the cumulative set of changes in the V2 spec, right? So that's typically how we've done it in the past, and I would say that that's the same thing here. Voting to make decisions is usually an anti-pattern. Voting to confirm a decision that we've all discussed and agreed on is the usual way that we want to go.
So I think we want to get the PR into a state that everybody's got general consensus around, like, hey, yeah, these are the tags we want to use. This is how we want it represented. And then we raise a vote pointing to that PR saying, hey, we want to adopt this into the REST spec. I think the only subtle difference that I would see between like the V2 spec and the REST spec is we tend to lean into the REST spec being just whatever happens to be in the REST spec document, because it's not versioned as a document as a whole. Whereas the V2, V3, we mean add features prior to actually adopting that table spec and saying it's a formally recognized new spec. So yeah, subtle difference there, but ultimately it's let's get it into a shape we generally agree, let's vote, and then let's commit. JB?
Yeah, just to second what Ryan said, the vote should be pretty kind of atomic, like we should decide on +1, -1 or fraction. So it's not really possible to have a vote with +1 for this, +1 for this, +1 for this. But it's never go very well that way. So we should better work on something which is almost already complete, or with something we can discuss on, and then you can trigger on board that can relay on +1, -1, 0, or even fraction if it's a code modification. But I mean, avoid to have vote with option. I mean, it's not really possible.
Okay, so it sounds like the consensus here is that we will keep reviewing the PR to a good state, and then I guess Edward is going to raise a vote in the dev list, right? Okay. So before I move to the discussion topics, any other comments? Okay, so the first topic, I see, Robert, you raised leftovers from last week. That's why I actually put the secureable objects in the top. Is there any other things you think were leftovers?
I think there was one, but I don't recall it now. I put it in like 5 minutes ago. Let me check. The RFC process was that discussed in the pre-plan and plan table APIs?
I think those were discussed, but I remember, JB, you were not here when we talked about RFC process. I think the conclusion we reached was that the Iceberg improvement proposal process is sufficient for pushing the REST back, and we don't need to introduce another RFC process in that case. Would you agree with that?
I agree. My only concern today is just if we can improve a little the validation of the spec at some point. But that's my, I mean, in the RFC thing, not with this adding new things. That's okay. I think that as we do today, it's fine. But it's just to be sure that we don't introduce anything that can break eventually an implementation or something like that. But I think it's the only way around. Is more the implementation that I should verify that the spec is okay. So yeah, I mean, using vote and proposal process as we do, I think it's okay. I agree.
Okay. And for pre-planned plan, I think we discussed last week a little bit. So I think there is a PR opening on our side. We need to update the PR. Let's postpone that discussion a little bit for the implementation side.
I just want to touch on that a little bit because I think the other one that we have for the server-side metadata table kind of overlaps with the pre-plan. And if that is something that we're going to consider for part of the pre-plan, do we need to update the pre-plan to have more information about like what is being scanned? Does it need to poke through anything that we don't use for data table scans that we would use for metadata table scans? I haven't really thought through what that would actually entail, but it sounded like that was the direction the conversation was going on the dev list. Is like, hey, you know, if we're going to do server-side metadata tables, is that just a pre-plan with a metadata table as the target? Is that the intent of it? I think, Russell, did you put that one up? Who was the originator of the...
I think Yufei put that up. I don't
Okay.
see him here. That kind of sounds like an implementation detail, though, or I'm not thinking this through.
So I would think that there may be things that we need to do in the pre-plan plan in terms of the representation of what's coming back, that you would need to accommodate in the pre-plan PR to do the server-side table. Because other than that, like, what is the metadata table planning other than planning a table, right? It just has a different representation or a different data set that you're operating on.
I guess the way it's currently implemented right now is a little bit rougher because you're kind of just having each metadata table its own implementation of like, this is what your tasks actually do. Yeah, it's a little weird.
Amog?
Yeah. So I think I commented this on the mailing list, but from like a scale perspective, I think it makes sense to reuse the plan pre-plan, because at the end of the day, like, because I think people were discussing about this, but at the end of the day, plan and pre-plan in the worst case have to be able to go through all the metadata. So it seems like, at least from that perspective. Now, from an API perspective, I think right now it's modeled as like everything has to be returned as a data file scan task, or yeah, with like a list of delete files to apply. And so if we can model that as like a metadata scan task, I don't know how you'd what exactly that would look like, but that would be something to think through. Maybe that's not really clean from a API perspective, but I haven't really thought about it.
I'm just thinking about the metadata implementations that are out there, because like Trino has ones that is like, hey, table properties, and the data file would actually be the JSON of the table, right? And so you would get a task back that would be the JSON of the data to read that. Other ones would be the Avro files for like manifest list or manifests. And while we probably can represent the Avro file, it's been a little while since I looked at the pre-planned PR. I think that, you know, you have the actual data file type in there. Is there anything that we need to do to map that to, hey, what is the actual schema that needs to be produced based on this? I don't know, Ryan, do you have any?
I have some serious reservations about introducing the metadata tables as actual things. And like, so far metadata tables is just a user construct. There's nothing in either the table spec or the view spec or the REST spec that calls out these, you know, special views of a table that you can think of as a table. I'm not sure that I would change that. I'm undecided, which is why I'm sort of, you know, not not saying a whole lot. But it seems a whole lot cleaner to me if we're not trying to, you know, expose things that aren't tables or things that aren't catalog objects as catalog objects, especially through this REST interface. So the way that I had thought about these problems in the past was basically with a, you know, a custom interface to expose things. So say I want to, you know, list the, trying to think of a good example. We've thought about this in the past in two cases. One is like metadata tables. So if I want to list, say, the snapshots of a table, should we just expose snapshots as a route? Should we have a way to expose a named table of data that's generic per table? Or do we want something like an information schema space where you can have your own information schema that's based on the catalog, and you can simply, like, you know, go query the information schema? Those are all, I think, very valid ways of doing this. And I would hesitate to go necessarily this direction if we can make it more generic and make something that, yeah, you can expose, you know, custom tabular data from your catalog through the endpoint.
Robert?
Yeah, so I think exposing more information, like maybe not just from the metadata JSON, but from manifest lists, manifest files. In principle, I think it's quite a good idea. What bothers me a bit is scenarios where, like, the user sits on the west coast of the US, but the actual data lake is I don't know, in Paris or something, right? So a long network up between that. And considering that manifest lists, and not that much, but manifest files can be quite big, that's a huge impact, right? So those things, I think, at least need to be kept in mind for those things. I mean, pushing data through internet backbones many thousand kilometers or miles, that's not a good practice in my opinion. Similarly, about generating like dynamic tables in Avro or whatever, so that goes hand in hand. Yeah, those are both basically my concerns. Not concerns, but like things that need to be taken into account. Not everything is local.
I completely agree with that. For certain metadata tables like files, we should definitely, you know, be able to break that up and probably go to the metadata.
Yeah, so I'm starting to think more that after what Ryan just said, that half of the metadata tables are about processing the things that kind of look like tables anyway, which is like files, entries. You know, those ones have an Avro schema. The other half of the metadata tables, history, snapshot, properties, you know, things like that, they're actually like how you interpret a JSON blob that happens to be our metadata representation. So like half of the tables kind of fit the model where you could make a metadata table pre-plan scan. The other ones are data structures that are not well schematized, can't really be projected in the way that you would think of like a table scan. So it makes it somewhat awkward for those cases, unless it was, you know, separate routes or something like that that would actually provide back a data set. And maybe the scale of the results of those two are different enough that we could say, hey, you have endpoints for some of them and other ones you can actually like plan and scan. But yeah, I don't think it's universally just like it fits what we're trying to accomplish here. Jack?
First of all, I think this is exactly what I want to discuss in the third topic, so I will just treat that as this discussion. Since Ife is not here and he cannot comment further. And from my take, I think for me, first of all, I totally agree with Daniel that there are basically these two different sets of different metadata tables. And when I bring up in the dev list about not potentially using pre-planned plan, that is only for those like manifest list, those kind of things. The other just are different interpretations of the JSON file, which we might not need to overcomplicate that to expose those as tables, because those can be expressed in different ways. And I also agree with Ryan that the metadata table is a construct that we might not want to expose as actual objects in catalog. To me, it seems more like columns, right? It's a part of the table, and you can configure things. Maybe you can access those informations, but it's never like an independent thing. And having information schema is definitely something I have been thinking about. That's like the most traditional database way to go with this. However, the drawback of information schema is that you basically access things in the entire catalog. I think people like the metadata table because you are basically accessing things that are only specific to the table, and it's pretty convenient. But on the other side, if you don't catalog those things, then it becomes very ambiguous, like how you do you have permission to access the metadata table versus having access to the data? And if there are leakage of information in the metadata table, we actually have lots of issues with that right now in Iceberg. Like some people say, oh, I really like metadata table, and I just want to access that if I have like describe table permission, right? Because I think that is a part of my metadata. But those information in the meta table actually leaks about what information are there in your table, like the upper bound, lower bound, those kind of things. So maybe having those information through scanning is a way to control the behavior. But yeah, to me, I'm still undecided. That is also why I originally put it as an item on the last sync, and hasn't removed it because I feel it was a bit too early. Maybe after we have pre-plan, it makes it more clear about do we want to add it to the API or do we not want to add it. That's kind of my current take.
So it sounds like there's quite a bit of unknown here, which is probably just means that we should think about this more clearly. Like, what are we really trying to accomplish with metadata tables? You know, like engine independence, I get. is it really worth going and adding quite a bit to the REST specification before we know what this is used for? I don't know. Like there's a good argument for like driving more things from purely the REST API, but I'm not sure that we necessarily need to go and do things like partitions or files tables for those. So it might just be something that we want to generally hold off on. Another thought is, is it possible today for a catalog implementation to treat a snapshots or other metadata tables as simply metadata tables? Right? Like I think if we wanted to implement the files table, for instance, saying select star from prod.db.table.files, I believe the Spark, I believe all of the implementations will actually look up the table and only convert to a metadata table implementation if the table is not found, right? So we always delegate to the thing being an actual catalog table before going and replacing it with a metadata table. So I believe that if you just generated the table metadata for a files table, you could just immediately use the pre-plan API. And maybe that's a good solution. That puts it in that makes the decision in the catalog rather than necessarily standardizing this before we know what it should look like. So I kind of like that option for a stopgap.
There is one potential idea, which is this concept of derived table, which is kind of becoming more and more popular these days, implemented in some vendors, which is basically for one table, you also provide a list of like its derived tables and its corresponding schemas, and you can find those tables also in the catalog and query those tables. And the use case I see mainly was for things like object tables. Basically, you treat I remember it's like a big lake, Go BigQuery feature that you so you can actually treat a storage bucket as kind of like an entity you have with derived tables, and you can query the corresponding derived table, which is like a metadata table of that bucket. So something like that.
So like just pointers to tables?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be a potentially good thing to do here. And that's kind of along the same lines as what I was thinking about with, like, say I want to expose, for example, Tabular had tabular specific configuration properties for a table. And, rather than keeping those in table properties where they didn't really belong, we kept them in our database. Well, say I want to have like tabular properties as a table, we could have an interface that exposes those things and just says like, well, here's a JSON representation of all those rows. We could have something that does essentially what you're saying, Jack, which is like, hey, what are the derived tables from this table? And then you have a way to query a specific derived table. But that's very different than something that would work, to Robert's earlier point, something that would work for files or partitions.
I just wanted to add to Jake's point about privileges. I mean, metadata sounds innocent, but it does already contain user data. So even if just in the form of lower upper bounds, but that's user data, and that needs to be in the same scope for any privilege check.
Any further comments before we move to the next?
Yeah. So we're largely actually talking to Yufei. I hope he goes and he watches this and hears all this feedback. I think piggybacking off of what Ryan was saying, there was an earlier discussion about, hey, can the catalog actually feed back data in some way? And like some people had proposed like an HTTP file IO, and there were a couple other options that were out there. With the pre-plan, I think it works well for anything that already has existing data. If you have to generate data in order to feed it back, that becomes a little bit more difficult. And so I think that there are things that obviously look like they would fit under this model. And then there are other ones where either the client has to adapt existing REST endpoints in their return, data. Because like, hey, table properties as a table is great. It already exists in the REST endpoint. So the client still has to do something if it's going to represent that. Or we have to figure out, well, how do we feed back something that is meaningful that the client can actually consume as like table data? So I think that there's value there. I think the HTTP thing is a little bit more complicated because then like everybody would need to be able to like consume from a stream as the actual like data input. Dennis?
Yeah, so actually you mentioned the streaming back, and also there's sort of in the comment thread in the doc talking about getting into the realm of big metadata. I wonder if there's also something else that's sort of creeping up here, which is this idea that even for the ones that today are essentially just pruning things out of the metadata JSON file, so snapshots, history, metadata log entries, these types of things. I mean, there are scenarios where these start growing somewhat large, maybe not into the realm of like having distributed files, but something where you don't want to ship around like a huge metadata, a huge JSON blob either. And I don't know if like today it seems like there's these two categories. One is the things that you would farm out to being a pre-planned scan type of thing, and the other ones are being things you retrieve from the metadata JSON. But would it make sense to talk about whether some of those things can be decoupled from the JSON as well, or split perhaps, right? So because right now if the JSON itself already grows more and more unwieldy by containing thousands and thousands of snapshots, thousands of metadata log entries, etc. Right? I guess this could be related, or a way to start thinking about how to decouple those.
Yeah, I know that there's been a couple of proposals for that, like specific endpoints. Like you mentioned, decoupling some of like, hey, if I just want table properties, but my entire table payload is huge, I kind of just get the properties. I think it's kind of on an as needed basis. We can look at those specific ones and say, hey, there's a particular problem we're trying to solve something by introducing like new endpoints for it. But I think we want to have the actual use cases and understand like what's actually leading to adding it, as opposed to just like adding a bunch of complexity to the REST catalog and hoping that maybe somebody will take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful, because this is a common protocol and a common standard, about adding convenience things for certain use cases where like that just increases the complexity of the overall protocol. Right, causes us to increase the number of server-side capabilities and a whole bunch of those things. We may want to collect a whole bunch of those. Right, if we want separate routes for properties and snapshots and history and previous metadata files or whatever, we might actually want to collect all of those into a single tag and a single set of routes that is a set of like richer table data to keep the implementation a bit cleaner.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what one thing I had in mind as well is looking at for example, in load table, if you're setting so there is already the parameter called snapshots. So in a way, like that's kind of getting into the world of saying like, okay, I only want the latest snapshot, maybe because you're only looking for the other thing. Like you don't want to load all the thousands of snapshots if you're if you're just looking for the schema or properties or something like that. So like maybe the litmus test would be like if that area of parameters sort of grows, maybe that would be a good time to look at how to express these other types of things in a similar way or move to something else.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Okay, so the next one is secureable objects. This is kind of a leftover from the last sync. That I think there are some new discussions also in the dev list, and I put 3 points here that are my understanding of the 3 things we kind of need some agreements on first, which are: do we want APIs for managing principals? Do we want APIs for grant revokes? And if so, what are the privileges we are granting? Is that a string or like specific verbs, which is kind of in my proposal, or I guess let's limit the discussion first to those 3 points first, and see what people think. Robert?
Yeah, so I was to be honest, I was a bit surprised by these principal management API, because I mean, Iceberg is still like a table format, and sure, we need to manage privileges in some way, but I think we shouldn't fall into the trap and implement a full IDP kind of thing, like full user management, full roles, other things, and then someone comes along, hey, I want something like that new fancy authorization mechanism, and adding a whole bunch of other stuff. And authentication authorization is complex in itself, and if I think managing principals is something that's not in the scope of Iceberg, in my opinion, at least. You sure need something that the server side needs to work with some IDP, but on the client side, it should basically be plain strings, basically some ID, which could be a name, which could be something else.
I think I'm next. The context here that we were using when we were initially thinking about these things was very much in line with what Robert is saying. It is that we want to pass the authorization policy, principles, and other details are not very standard. And it doesn't help much to have a subset of either policy or principles or whatever that are subject to these grant, revoke, or management APIs. You kind of want an API that's all or nothing, we thought. And so what we tried to do was have a minimal exposure between the REST API and the other. So this was why we said, okay, like auth is gonna, authentication happens through HTTP headers in most cases. Whether that's a bearer token, whether that is SIGV4, the authorization header can take care of a lot of these things, and primarily go with that, and let the service do everything else internally, the user management, the policy, and things like that. And that's just because, again, the policy varies so much across systems. Whether there's a future permission, just the different permissions alone are pretty variable. And then you've also got systems like Starburst that has ABAC type policies, which are not being contemplated here. There are lots of different types of principles and things like that. So I want this. My interest here is for the API to remain largely neutral. which is like, if we can make this generic enough to contain anything, and we say like, hey, this is just the setup for a grant revoke, but what you're granting and revoking is completely up to the service. I think I'm okay with that, but I would try to keep those concerns separate, rather than trying to standardize here, because standardization in the auth space is very, very difficult. Sorry, I talked a long time. I'll hand it off to Dennis, who I think was next.
I know I'm jumping. I just actually want to second that. A simple grant X to Y and a revoke X from Y. That's probably enough.
Yeah, and a thought that came to mind there, on the concept of, whether, principals, having these, principal objects sort of get into the world of actually doing identity and being an identity provider. And I was wondering, like if the intended use case for how we wield these things is fundamentally just to serve as a grantee object, and maybe if the spec is not opinionated at this, at this layer about whether the principal is, one or many, or how. So in this case, I guess what I'm getting at is maybe I don't know if the people who were expressing concerns about having this principle would have their concerns mitigated if it were just a role, for example, right? Because where I see some terminology somewhat common across places is that principal sometimes implies like the actual identity, that something that you're audit logging, something that represents maybe a human user, something like that, compared to roles which are a little bit more open-ended, meaning like maybe you have group roles, or you have things that are just for privilege expansion and bundling things, versus some things are assumable roles and those kinds of things. So maybe I guess I'm suggesting a simple naming change of that to be roles instead of principles.
So I think I'm next. In light of all of the confusion and discussion here, it may help to go back and try and understand what are we actually trying to solve for like users and for systems that are integrating with Iceberg here. Is it primarily a case where, hey, I'm creating tables and I need to be able to grant access to those tables so that I don't have to like split across two different systems? Is that really what we're trying to solve for? Or are we actually trying to go the full spectrum of, I should be able to fully manage all of my DCL kind of capabilities within any engine that can support whatever this interface looks like? Because that gets to what Ryan was talking about, like, hey, this is a really broad space with a lot of contradictory kind of both implementation as well as representation. Or are we just trying to ease some of the typical situations that people run into?
I guess to jump in the line here, let me provide some context of why we are putting up this proposal. So there are two reasons. The first reason is we want to, let's take Spark as an example. We want to have a full SQL suite of everything people can do in the data warehouse using Spark, which includes all these grant revoke that administrators usually do. And we don't want to have let people install two different Spark extensions, one in Iceberg, one in something else, like glue their catalog to make that happen. Ideally, things just happen with the Iceberg extension and the implementation, which in our case is or whatever, like glue, something like that, can be mapped to fulfill those operations. That is the general intention. So I think from that perspective, the goal of not really standardizing on something, but just to have a generic interface is our goal there. And also the other reason for this proposal was because of another proposal we had for having access decisions. And we realized that not agree on some basic verbs seems to be difficult for us to also push in that domain. So that is why, at least in the privileges part, we are trying to see if we can come up with some agreements. Maybe this is some standardization, but just very loosely defined contracts about how we express privileges of the table. So those are the two intentions we have. in putting out these proposals.
Okay, I guess I'm next. So I'm one of the persons who actually put concerns on the document regarding the user principle. I think for me, like I'm kind of like following Ryan and Daniel and Robert. Those APIs seems very like catalog management and doesn't really help with like the use of Iceberg tables and engine interactions. Like you need maybe like help on what are the decisions, the policy decisions between so that the engine can basically implement what the catalog is trying to enforce. But like considering the broad set of models out there to do access control and IDP and things, like that model is already like constraining things, or is already like excluding some actors. It's not, and you will see more and more people trying to scope things and stuff, and that makes like basically like a own project on its own. And I don't think at that point like Iceberg wants to be like a catalog systems, and like it's still focusing on the table format. So for me, like that's not something I would want to be really like done that way in the Iceberg project.
Who was next?
I guess I'm next. I'm Sumit. I'm from LinkedIn. So I think there are two aspects to this, right? One is like the principle which we have talked about, and I agree with Ryan, Robert, everyone who's talking about that should be kept outside of the spec in whatever we are using in our organizations, Active Directory, LDAP, IAM, all that, right? I think the other aspect is the privileges. If you look at the SQL spec for grant and revoke, it was built with an assumption that you had a proxy that was routing all your SQL statements. Maybe it is a SQL server or all the data warehouses out there, right? I don't think that model directly applies to Iceberg, specifically when we want to make sure Iceberg tables can be queried from Spark, Iceberg Java API, Strino, all the different kinds of engines. So I kind of think that we need to have a narrow set of privileges which can realistically support in Iceberg with all the assumptions on where the data can get queried from, and we can be opinionated about that. But supporting a whole spectrum, I think it's unrealistic in the current, and this is based on our implementation of securing Iceberg tables at LinkedIn.
Yeah. So actually, to that point, oh, and by the way, if, for anyone who, I forgot to introduce I'm Dennis Ho from Snowflake. So to that point, I do feel like there's, I guess to everyone's prior points about wanting to build in, just the primitives that are absolutely necessary, not build the whole RBAC system into this spec, but still to be able to have the things, a little bit standardized around what primitives and how they work. I think there is an element of these privileges where even if it's not part of the syntax of a spec, like let's say we're not introducing specific grant revoke APIs, so hypothetically, but and we're trying to introduce something very general. It seems like there's a couple privileges, also to Sumed's point about like what's actually feasible to support. A couple that we want to still have like some opinion in the spec about, in particular for things like how privileges interact with, let's say, credential vending. Or, in the prior discussion, we were talking about how, some kinds of metadata, if you're giving upper and lower bounds of pre-planned scan, or, giving contents of manifest files, those actually contain user data as well, right? So like how to be able to model how a privilege model should interact with those, or, to have a granularity that can express that kind of privilege seems important. To avoid, divergent implementations. Yeah, not data about users, but like upper lower bounds are user data, right? Like in manifest.
Oh, you're talking about
in the prior,
data
so like,
from the table.
Exactly, like if you can get the select maximum of credit card numbers or something, right? Like that's
but I mean the way it currently works, and this was you present an identity And if that identity can get the information, the catalog sends it back, right? Like that is independent of how that catalog makes the decision about the, whether that user can see the information, right? It's just, can this user see this information, yes or no? And then you fail with an error code or you don't. So like, I think that still works fairly cleanly.
I think it is not sufficient though, right? Because I can bypass the catalog and go to directly the files and like try to do some reads on the files, because there's nothing enforcing the Iceberg table API when you query data from a table.
So that is true, right? So you have to not provide blanket access to the underlying data files if you want real security with the catalog API. Right, which is why we introduced the credential vending and signing APIs as well, so that the catalog can be in the mix there and say like, okay, you can read this table, here's a temporary scoped credential to be able to access the underlying files.
Makes sense.
I think Tyler was next.
Yeah, hey, I'm Tyler from Snowflake. I guess mine is sort of half comment, half question. And it seems to me, as a relative newcomer here, that like a lot of what Iceberg has done and what the existing catalog API has done is to say, hey, let's push for some standardization here, because it helps, it helps interoperability, it helps, helps everybody move forward and not have this like proliferation of different choices. So to me, it feels like saying, look, everybody clearly needs, these security constructs. Yes, there's quite a different, there's a lot of different ways that people are doing these, principles and things. Do they need to have that many different ways? I feel like Iceberg as a project is kind of standing in this position where it can actually help push for some standardization and push for some simplification, because I don't think the existing space where, like everybody's kind of doing their own thing, it doesn't seem like it's particularly beneficial to users. And so, for me, like just from like a principles perspective, it feels like that's a good reason to try to push for this and use the weight of Iceberg to kind of make some momentum there. So I'm curious for your thoughts on this, of you folks who've been here, because if you've got credential vending and things like that, obviously it's not, it's already bleeding into the catalog space, right? This isn't just a pure table format spec. So the arguments of like Iceberg's just a table spec feel like they fall flat to me. Like there's already a whole bunch of stuff that's not table format in there. So anyway, that's my.
Yeah. Does anyone mind if I take that one, since that was kind of a question? Okay, cool. Yeah, you're right. You're right that it is not just a table spec, right? And we are trying to standardize this area. We're sort of blazing new trail here, where we're standardizing a whole bunch of things, and we're trying to figure out while we go what goes in the standardized bucket or the centralized bucket of things. And so it's not real clean. So we have to figure out what makes sense there. So for certain things that I think do make sense, right? Like how a catalog interacts with that Iceberg table spec, right? And then sort of hey, we also need maybe view objects or something like that. Like we're trying to standardize, and like what you said makes sense. This is an area where I'm wondering how much standardization is possible. So that's the big unknown here, right? If we were all saying like, yes, we have the SQL spec that clearly lays out, different privileges for these things, and second of all engines actually follow that, then I'd be like, okay, we can definitely standardize this area, because it's just about how do we express the things from this other spec over the wire. In this case, though, like what engines actually tend to do are like ABAC policies with different attributes, RBAC policies with very different inheritance, cascading behavior, and even down to different privileges, right? Do you have a separate update privilege and a separate merge privilege, or do you have a general modify privilege? Like there are and then we've got the whole space of principles. So like, to me, how far we should go into this area is what can all of these engines use without trying to force everyone on a standard that just isn't going to be enforceable, right? Because if you have a standard that only goes halfway and you've got to have like an extension API to that standard, what was the point of saying that we all support the same standard, right? And if you also have a standard that, you know, doesn't actually standardize anything, because all it's saying is like, we have a grant endpoint that you send arbitrary JSON to, then like what? So to me, it's just a question of where do we go on that spectrum of a grant endpoint that accepts arbitrary JSON all the way to a grant endpoint that has very specific constructs that everyone must support. Hopefully that sounds reasonable.
I think that makes sense. I mean, do we have a sense for like what the space of players that we need to care about here is? Like, is it like, you know, there's Glue, there's Tabular, there's Unity, there's, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, has anybody done that exercise of like looking at like, what do catalogs, what do, you know,
I don't think you should do that exercise actually, because then we're just encompassing like, what does the current space look like? And there are always going to be people who fall outside of that, or new emerging things that may look different. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a good exercise to do. I think the question really comes down to, we've got three kind of options ahead of us. Like, one, ignore this, throw it, just say privileges, security stuff is outside of the Iceberg spec. And we've kind of said that for a while. The other extreme is, let's fully enumerate everything we expect everybody to implement if they're going to implement this. That's hard, possibly impossible, and people would largely ignore it. Then there's a middle ground, which would be something where we say, hey, maybe we support a grant and revoke with no enumeration of privileges or principals. And that's the level of support that we allow, where you can post something in there and then it's up to the catalog to interpret and allow it or not. So I think that this is going to be a long discussion. I think we have to either do something in the middle range or do nothing at all. Dimitri?
Yeah, thanks. So from that point of view, it feels like the actual implementation of those grants is also kind of is going to be somewhat engine specific, right? So Spark may implement it one way, Trina another way. To me, it looks like we may want to think about actually, like the way I see it is that, say we have an extension that comes into the catalog, and then the extension basically wants to be part of the catalog in the sense that it wants to talk to the same server using the same credentials, but exercise some other functionality that is maybe specific to a particular server. Because if we agree that actual grant behaviors may be specific to the server implementation, then the extension may want to leverage them, but kind of going through the catalog channel, right? So what I'm trying to drive at is it feels like we may want to define an extension mechanism for code running inside on the Iceberg client side to discover extra capabilities that may be specific to a particular extension. I think there was discussed part of the V2 REST spec a bit, but to me it looks like the grants kind of fall into that area. So if there is a particular capability that the server exposes and the extension can recognize it and then connect to it through basically share the same REST client, for example, that already has an established authenticated communication channel, wouldn't that be sufficient? And then the extension basically can leverage whatever logic is applicable in that particular situation.
I think to your point about teaching each engine how these different privileges are going to behave is going to be really hard problem. And that's why I agree it's a broad spectrum and we need to land somewhere on the spectrum, which is something that can be interoperable between engines. And that's like, it's like, how do you differentiate a describe from a select, or how do you differentiate a merge from an update, right? These are reads versus writes kind of a privilege. And if you have those kind of very low level narrow APIs for privileges, then you don't need to teach these engines that, okay, hey, like this is how you differentiate a describe or a select. So I think having a narrow set of privileges, which are as simple as like just reads and writes, would be a good first step to standardization, and it is more like in line with like where we are going with the catalog and the spec.
I think I'm next. Yeah, just want to add also, like, and what basically repeating what many others said, but even the same privilege can mean totally different things for different catalogs or engines or combinations of those. I mean, think read could mean like, hey, you can read metadata JSON, you can read the manifest files, you can read all data files. Other engines might have select, insert, update, very fine grained, however they enforce it. We could reserve some privilege names, but that would also sacrifice flexibility a bit. So I think I think it's possible to find a way forward, but it's a tricky one. Not being too restrictive, but not also, but at the same time not to be too flexible. Yeah.
I think so. I'll throw out there one thought, which is that I think to simplify this space, this is where we came up with the access control decision rather than access controls. So rather than telling the client like, hey, here are the privileges that you have, you know, like you can run update but not modify, but not merge or something like that. We said like we can have a very small set of restrictions that are something that we are confident can be easily expressed. So this is, you know, this user can read the following columns. Don't show this user anything from the other columns. Don't filter on those columns, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So those sorts of things, I think that's a narrower problem, and we may want to actually go there. But in general, I think we do need to think very carefully about what is centralized and what is specialized, and ask the hard questions to sort of frame this space. Would it be so bad if you had to go through a particular engine or a particular interface to configure access controls, and you didn't just have blanket grant standardized across Trino and Spark and Snowflake and everything, right? So if your access controls are, you know, integrated into a, you know, web browser interface or a, you know, Snowflake interface, and that's the only place that you can edit or make changes or view those access controls, that seems like an actually pretty reasonable thing, because you have one catalog that defines those access controls and one place to modify and manage those access controls, and you don't really want any confusion over what access controls mean or what you have or have not granted, or like, oh, hey, what happened? You know, who granted this access? What engine did it come through? Where, you know, what did that request actually look like? This seems like something that could be simply, you know, centralized to a single interface or engine, and does not need to be in every specialized engine across the board.
So I'm going to just disagree a little bit with that. I don't think it's actually reasonable, just because of the ETL kind of use cases where, you know, you're constructing a data set, and then you also need to set the privileges as part of that, you know, construction process. You don't want to have a person in the loop to go and update a UI. I think there's a lot of value of being able to execute that from a statement in an engine.
But shouldn't you just get the privileges you need on create? I mean,
you're assuming future privileges, like that's already assuming a certain behavior. So that's where I like, there are a lot of engines that don't support that concept. So like the approach that I would think, like if we want to go generically and like open up the door to be able to execute these things, but not be restrictive about what they actually are or what they do, would be more, we just say we support a standardized DCL for a grant and revoke with unenumerated privileges and unenumerated principals. And then, you know, like Spark would just have to interpret whatever that privilege is, send it to the catalog, and now it just becomes a catalog responsibility. Do I know what this thing is? Do I know what a future select looks like? And if I don't, I kick it back and I say, hey, I don't know what that privilege is. If it is, then you're actually just talking about what is the catalog capability as opposed to what is the actual client capability. Because largely all you're doing at that point is just proxying through grant and revoke statements.
I mean, at that point, why are we even talking about this, right? OAuth supports all these OAuth policies in their own tokens, right? You can shove in like what you have to do. So you can do it completely transparently outside of Iceberg.
It's the SQL statement, though. That's
yeah,
what
it's making changes.
Yeah.
That Dan is talking about. Tyler, I think you were next.
Oh, I was sorry. I'm kind of processing what Dan was saying now and wondering if it changes my attitude. But anyway, I guess I was going to naively continue to play devil's advocate and just say, to the comments of, there's all these different, some engines have blanket read, some engines have select and other fine grained stuff. I guess that's true, but I feel at the end of the day, there's only so many things you can do here, right? Like there are definitely different approaches in finer grained or coarser grained, but I feel like they end up being kind of, the coarser grained tend to encapsulate the finer grained. And I feel like there's probably a path to saying like, from reading perspective, maybe there's 4 different things you can do from a reading perspective. Some engines may just say you can read and that gives you all of them. Some may be like, well, maybe you can do 2 out of the 4. I feel like this, I just intuitively feel like there is a path here towards, bringing some clarity and some standardization across this, area, even if there is this kind of proliferation of varying things, because at the end of the day, there's only so many things you can do with a table. Like, let's be honest, like it's not an infinite space, right?
That's why my approach is to don't try and restrict, just leave those unenumerated. Let it be a catalog concern about what the privilege is and how it's going to apply. But then it's also on the catalog to decide whether it can enforce those privileges or if it has to just deny access. So if it was something very narrow, like, hey, you can only read partitions that of data that are in your, locale or something like that. If it can't enforce that, then it shouldn't grant that privilege or shouldn't allow access. So again, this is a lot of what's happening with the catalog is pushing the concerns onto the catalog implementation and kind of removing the client from that. So in Spark or Trino, they could just proxy whatever privilege to the catalog, and then the catalog gets to decide if it knows and understands how to apply that and enforce it.
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense. I still wonder if there's value in trying to define the space a little better, but on the other hand, it's definitely a nice backdoor of just being like, look, it's not a problem.
Because I feel like this is less of a specification problem and more of a utility problem for people. It's like they have all these engines and they all have DCL commands and they all want to be able to make some changes to privileges as part of their workflows or something else. And we just need a way to allow that to happen against a reference catalog implementation. What are we actually trying to define the space, or are we just trying to enable people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we definitely need to enable people. I guess for me, it feels like an open question of whether there's value in defining the space or not. But I certainly hear the arguments either way.
Yeah, on the point of enabling people, I think it's a good idea, although I'm still not sure that the simple privilege and principal model is going to be sufficient, because say if somebody wants to implement responsibility separation and they want to do things like grant X to user Y with grant privilege or something like that, that's already kind of adding another dimension to the model. And are we going to be able to express that in the simple grant and principal scheme, right? What I'm trying to say is that even if we have to do a simple thing to enable people, it may not be complete enough for some use cases, right? That's why I'm suggesting that maybe we can consider that as an extension interface where we don't actually specify the exact model of privileges, but rather maybe define it as a separate interface and be it vendor specific or something like that.
I'm not sure what I'm next. Okay. So I think consensus is pretty much okay. We want to enable people to do these kind of things. So starting maybe with a ground X to Y or and such. The issue is obviously, okay, how far can a particular system go? How specific can it be? Can it do restriction on columns? Can it do restrictions on rows? Can it do X, Y, Z? I think that's rather a matter of how certain user interfaces actually define, for example, an SQL statement, right? So Dimitri's example with grant privilege or on column XYZ or something like that. I think that's rather a syntactic kind of problem. Having some interfaces on the REST API that in theory allows it, maybe not that much of a deal. When an engine comes back and says, hey, I can't do this. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm using a flat file system that can't do anything on the columns. Okay, fair enough. Not sure whether I was very good in expressing what I want to say, but like allowing to implement these, for example, Spark SQL extensions to do these things, whether a particular implementation supports it or not, 4.1, 5.1, whatever.
I think that's a good point. Like implementations don't have to implement the full thing. But I think that kind of opens up one of the problems here, which is like, how much of this do we want to specify? Right? Like, do we need, fine-grained column and row level access? What does it look like to specify those things through this interface? We know that, and my point earlier was, do we want to go just halfway? Right? So if we're talking, we've got certainly the RBAC, right? RBAC with generic principles and generic privileges seems pretty tractable, right? Even if we have like a couple of flags for whether or not your grant statement had a, with grant or with admin or a future, like, we can model some of those things. But once we start getting into, passing filters that potentially contain arbitrary SQL joins, how do we actually represent those column level things? I know a few of our systems use tags to represent column level restrictions, but then there's policy behind the tags, right? And like we're just getting so far into this space that I can't imagine that we're going to cover it all and standardize all of it. Or if we did, that we'd be, here in a year from now talking about how to standardize, certain aspects of it. That kind of scares me. I kind of want to make sure that we have, as someone who looks after specs and has thought about specs a lot in the last 5 years, it really scares me to, be opening that can of worms, because I want to be able to like get to a point where we're helping users achieve their goals and like, you're able to do things without necessarily spending all of our time for the next 2 years standardizing all the different things that you can do in this space.
Maybe that's a good point to end this. We're like 20 minutes over.
Yes.
So why don't we call it? Like, there's a lot of thinking to do about this. This is obviously a big thing to think through. Probably a good time for everybody to go back and spend some time noodling on it.
Yeah, I think in particular, the scope.
Yeah.
How far down this path do we want to go?
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for having this discussion. See you
Thank
guys
you.
next week.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.